Hi, I'm Maura, and I'm here with a few reading Olympians to give you some advice on how to be a good reading Olympian. Let's get started.
Gabby, what advice would you give to the next reading Olympians?
I would give advice to have two people reading every book that is for reading Olympics.
And what would you do differently if you could do it again?
I would read more books, definitely.
Jackson, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
Do not get worried during the contest.
And what would you do differently?
I would read a lot more books.
Ryder, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
Read more.
And what would you do differently?
Read the books more carefully.
Olivia, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
For next year's reading Olympians, I would make sure to not doubt yourself, because in the competition it's not as hard as long as you've read the books and work together as a team.
And what would you do differently?
I would make sure to have at least 2 or 3 people read the books, because the questions sometimes can be really twice and have multiple people read it instead of just one different person.
And what would you do differently?
I would have read the books that I didn't think were going to be as interesting, so I would have been able to answer more questions and we would have done better at the competitions.
Matthew, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
I would say you should read more than 8 books, because once the competition comes, they have a lot. Some of the books that people read, there's not a lot of people read them, and then you get the questions right.
And what would you do differently?
I would probably ask better questions, because some of the questions that I asked were easy, and then after competition, some of the ones were harder than what I asked.
Evan, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
Read carefully and don't go too fast.
And what would you do differently?
I definitely read a lot slower.
Sophia, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
You definitely have to read all 8 of your books and even more of them, and pay attention to like little details, but not everything.
And what would you do differently?
I would read more books.
Lauren, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
I would say that you should have at least 2 people read each book, maybe more.
And what would you do differently?
I would plan out ahead more, so we had everyone read the books ahead of time instead of rushing at the end.
Toby, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
Next year I would say definitely read more than the 8 books that you have to read.
And what would you do differently?
I would read more books.
George, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
To read slower and to have more than one person read each book.
And what would you do differently?
I would try to read more and to read more slowly.
Alana, what advice would you give to next year's reading Olympians?
Well, I would say just read as much as you can, like on your free time.
And what would you do differently?
I'd probably have read more.
Hey, it's Maura again, and I just want to say that reading Olympics is a blast, and you'll have a blast as long as you read. If you keep reading, by the time the competition comes around, you'll have a great time. Hope you enjoy reading Olympics.